I'd like to welcome Anders Brownworth to the stage. Anders works in applied research on CBDCs with the Payment Strategy Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Previously, he worked at Circle, involved with designing and launching the USDC stablecoin. He co-taught the first blockchain class at MIT and previously helped create and launch Republic Wireless, a Wi-Fi cellular hybrid smartphone service. Brownsworth holds a number of patents in the telecom space and played a key role in Bandwidth.com's evolution from startup to public company. Thank you, Anders, and welcome.
Absolutely, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I'd like to thank the MIT Bitcoin Club, by the way, for inviting me once again. Last time I gave a talk here, it was many years ago. I introduced a project called Spark, which later became USDC. So it's fun to be back, and thanks a lot for the invite. Just a quick disclaimer right up top. These are my opinions, not those of the Federal Reserve. And don't ask me policy questions. We're doing technical research, so you know, we're really focused on more of the technical stuff and less on the policy. So as mentioned, I'm a member of a team at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and what we're doing is we're working with the MIT Digital Currency Initiative to build a hypothetical central bank digital currency, right? So why are we doing that? Well, we really want to know what the capabilities and the constraints of new technology, like what it presents. And then we want to see like how that can be applied to the goals of central banks in, you know, in general, such as like, for example, increased financial inclusion, you know, like what are the goals of central banks that maybe these newer technologies can present. So we want to look at the existing landscape and ask what we've learned from the advancements and what challenges you know, digital currencies might present if they're issued by a central bank. It's a, you know, so there's sort of a different, I mean, the whole point of this talk is really there's a difference to how you might roll something out versus a public cryptocurrency. They're you know, so a bunch of similarities, but some differences. You know, there's some well understood approaches to distributed databases that are interesting, you know, from sort of years past. But then there's these newer things that we've learned given the last 12 years or so of public cryptocurrencies. So then the first big realization that I think I had is there's really not a single project out there that you can really, you know, just use. Like nothing really addresses the unique needs of a central bank that wants to issue a digital currency. Like, you know, nothing fits. You can't just take something and you know, Spinal Tap, turn it up to 11. That's really not gonna work. So let's step through a couple of the things. Let's take transactions, for example. So estimates are that there are about 15,000 cash transactions per second at peak. Okay, and so let's say there's probably 40 to 50,000 credit card transactions per second as well. But if there is a central bank digital currency that, say, you know, might support computer to computer transactions, in other words, transactions where there's not a human that decides, you know, we're going to do this or not. You know, they're running programs that have allowances essentially. So you can see that globally, right, you might be in the 100,000 transactions per second range, probably conservatively, right? So early on in Bitcoin, just as a you know, sort of an example here, early on in Bitcoin, there were about 250 bytes for a transaction. That's about the size. Now, you know, it hovers probably about twice that. But let's be conservative and let's say, you know, let's just go with 250 bytes. So at 100,000 transactions per second, that's 8.64 billion transactions, or almost 2 terabytes of data per day. So now you have to take all of that and send it to all of the nodes and record it, et cetera, just so people can sort of sift through it and find their transactions, in that pile. So, to be clear about this, the main reason blocks are distributed is so that you can find out that you were paid. If you put an address on a billboard, that's how you find out, right? So at 2 terabytes a day, that's probably easily out of most people's capability. Even if you drop most of the data, just accepting that much really isn't practical for most. So you need some sort of a way to deal with that problem. How do you find out that you're paid if you can't afford to accept all the blocks? Do you elect nodes that handle that kind of scale and, just trust them? That might be a way to do it. Maybe you use payment proofs somehow out of band. Maybe the sender and receiver kind of let each other know. That would kind of knock out the billboard example. But you really do, you need an answer to that question. Things start to break down if you really crank it too high. So here's another observation. So Bitcoin is very monolithic, for good reason. But it is monolithic. So in Bitcoin, you have a peer-to-peer networking stack. You've got a transaction gossip protocol and a block gossip protocol, a transaction verification system, a block verification system, optionally maybe some mining in there. There's a wallet implementation, maybe RPC support. You get the idea, right? There's a lot of pieces in that essentially monolithic executable. So now, do you need all of that? Well, you need most parts of that if you're running your own self-contained nodes. Makes good sense to sort of roll it all into one executable. But if you really need to get better performance, you might want to break that up a little bit. So now, of course, there's implementations that drop some pieces like the wallet, et cetera. But if you're going to squeak like every single last bit of performance, you probably want to really break things up down to their simplest parts. In some parts, they might naturally scale differently. Some can be parallelized, while others need to be run really as a single instance. Think for a second about the global transaction order. Like Bitcoin provides a global transaction order. I can't really think of a way to get around running everything through a single instance to come up with a global order. If you can, we're hiring, get in touch with me. My DMs on Twitter are open. Anyway, but just thinking about static analysis, right? Checking signatures, for example, there's basically no reason that you can't really parallelize that massively. And then there's the state of the system. What UTXOs exist at any given time. Can't you spread that across a bunch of machines? It seems like there might be something there. So that means that some parts of the system can pretty much scale linearly, while others, have pretty clear bottlenecks. So then the question becomes, okay, what can you do without? Maybe there's something to gain there. So let's talk about cash. Some guy, in Pasadena, let's say, decides to buy a sandwich with cash, right? And so someone else here in Cambridge decides to do exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Cash supports that, right? Do we need to know which one happened first? No, it really does, it doesn't matter. Well, what about transactions on the internet? We would care about that transaction in Pasadena, if it happened to be spending some of the same funds that you're accepting in Cambridge, right? There'd be a double spend there. Is there a way around that? So there's a lot of issues there, and I think lots of different ways to think about them. So let's do another thought experiment. If we're writing software for an entity that issues a fiat currency, presumably, that makes consensus relatively easy, right? You say it happened, it happened. That's pretty simple. The problem that Bitcoin first solved was how to come to consensus in a trust minimized way. But if you're the issuer, that's not necessarily your problem, right? That sort of makes sense. So then what about the economic model about those transactions, right? So, if you were to make all of them free. Well, with cash, you have to create cash first. That costs money. There's a cost to managing the life cycle of cash. You have to make it, you have to move it, you have to distribute it, and take it back again. There's even an office that deals with, currency that's been mutilated in some way or burned or whatever. Like there's ways to deal with it. But then when you spend cash, there's not a transaction fee, right? Yeah, maybe there is in the sense that you have to carry the cash around, store it in your wallet or whatever, and you have to put it on the counter, but you're not charged an avert fee in the currency for your cash transactions, right? So that's a pretty kind of basic thing with cash. It's kind of independently verified. So why does this matter? Well, let's look at digital currency transactions. That is a cost to clear, right? It might not be large, but it has this ongoing cost to support the transactions. So if we make that free, then people are just gonna abuse it. So you have to have a way to essentially deal with the spam problem. Fees in Bitcoin are really a solution to stop people from spamming the network. So what are the spam strategies, spam mitigation strategies for CBDCs, right? You could take a fine, like a tiny bit per transaction. It doesn't really mimic cash, but that might be one way to do it. You could also solve it by requiring identity or, and not allowing more than a set number of transactions per identity. Another interesting idea is to charge a proof of work on a per transaction basis, right? That might be interesting. But, of course, a proof of work option, it causes issues with low power wallets. Like, if you wanted to support a physical card-like instrument, or something like that in a relatively low power environment, that would be a problem. But if you did that, maybe people would just hire a third party to do proof of work for them. But then that really just, it passes the fee on in another way. So that's there's lots of different ways you could kind of think about that. And you could also, think of a combination of these strategies as a solution. Maybe you could, tier things by transaction value, or supply proof of control over a larger set of assets, which might allow you a lower fee threshold of some sort. One gets the idea that quite a bit of thought is really necessary for this unique problem. Here's another example. Let's say you wanted to support person-to-person digital payments where limited or no connectivity exists. One or both of the devices don't have a connection to the network. So maybe there's, power outages due to a hurricane, natural disaster, or whatever. Or maybe you're just out middle of nowhere where there isn't, any network connectivity. So how can you gain reasonable assurance that double spends in an environment like that, don't have effect, like if you don't have a network connection? Like that's a kind of a difficult problem. So there's some interesting ideas on this, where if only one device has connectivity, it might be able to pass the other device signed state updates of what it last heard. Or you might think about it by limiting the collateral damage of a double spend by limiting transaction size, or by lowering the transaction proportionally by time since the last connectivity. So now there's all sorts of ways that can be attacked. Again, a really difficult problem. So one last example. In the world of cash, you have processes for minting and redemption. So the way minting works, an order gets placed literally to print some amount of physical cash. So it obviously takes a bit of time to do that, right? You have to get suppliers together, you have to physically move things around. If all goes well, you have new reserves ready to go into circulation. But those bills don't yet have value. They might look identical to something in circulation, but it isn't on the books quite yet. So it literally, it doesn't even have value. So when it enters circulation, like suddenly it has value. It's kind of a fine point, but you have there's a velocity speed bump built in right there. It takes time and effort to bring new bills into circulation. So let's say you had a CBDC. What does issuance look like? Well, you could just add currency by flipping a few bits, right? So, there isn't that built-in inertia there that the cash world has. So you need to do something about that. You might limit minting to a small set of keys, to a reserve account that would then spend it. That might be one way of doing it, but that still might not be enough. You could programmatically enforce minting allocations somehow, or you could require a set of keys to sign off, each with its own, physical component, something like that. You could also combine these things in different ways. My hunch is that might not be a bad idea to have multiple layers here. The physical key custody piece, that's also quite difficult. It's simple on the surface, but when you actually really dig in, and build out maybe vaults with access control and all the auditing hardware and software and personnel involved, it's a serious project. We've learned a bit about this from the crypto industry, but there's a lot more to learn there. That's a particularly deep area right there. So I haven't mentioned the potential for interest rates or really dug much into programmability or, very important point, privacy. Each of these presents unique opportunities and challenges. So the main point here is that the field, it's generally not deeply understood for this use case, the use case of CBDCs. So if we want a digital currency to be performant for everyday transactions on a global scale, we can't just take something off the shelf and crank it up to 11. That's really not going to work. So then what do? Well, we have to think about this. We have to carefully consider what the technology presents and learn about what we can and can't reasonably do. And because, that it's not on the shelf, we have to learn by, making it and testing it. So how do we do that? Well, we could just take a really big computer and stick it in the basement of the Fed somewhere and do all the transactions there, right? Well, it would work. It would be very fast, but not really. What if the power goes out or the network goes down? All right, well, so we'll distribute it a bit, right? We'll put, some computers in a bunch of farms all over the place. Then we'll survive the power outages and we'll probably get some increased availability out of that. Okay, great. But then how do we keep them all in sync? Well, the field of distributed computing has a lot to say about this. So there's a lot to learn, right there. But then if we just use distributed computing technologies that have been well understood for really decades, we might just end up building a faster version of what we already have. So I think it probably makes sense to consider what new capabilities and new ways of thinking there are lately. And that's where we start to look at the emergence of digital bearer instruments and things like smart contracts and say, maybe we can do better. Maybe we can do something more interesting. But you have to do all of these things prudently. A central bank must retain public trust. So while you have to investigate new things and see what the technology offers, you really have to deeply understand them. And understand the threat model. And, you got to know, like, for example, how you're going to upgrade such a system, because you put something in place, it's not in place for months or years, it's decades, it's a long time. So it really needs to be a robust system. So that's part of the goal with what we're doing with MIT. I like to say that we're making a sushi menu. So let's build something and then we'll test it and then let the data tell us where to go from there. And then when we're done, we have this sushi menu that allows a central bank to say, all right, I want this much of this and that much of that. And then what does that do to my throughput? Like, what can I reasonably expect? And because we've actually tested that combination, we could tell you, you'll know what to expect. So for example, some smart contract execution or zero knowledge proof strategy, it would probably cause a big computational overhead on a system like that. So, you might say, well, that's parallelizable, right? But by how much? What additional processing would need to be added to reach a certain throughput goal? The best way to do it is to actually do it, right? Ramp something up at the types of scale that you might see on a global level and figure out what it would take. Does it actually scale linearly or does it follow a very different pattern? Is there a point where it just, falls off a cliff because of some, obscure networking bottleneck that maybe you weren't thinking about? That's the kind of thing that you need to learn when you actually build something. So that's really the output. We want to deeply understand all of the options, and we want to really understand how they interact. So we're going to be building a hypothetical CBDC, and we're going to run it through its paces and see how it operates in a wide variety of conditions. We might learn that the right way to do this is to use already existing well-understood technology, or we might find out that basically a complete rethink is the right approach. But what we do know is the best way to figure all of this out is to go and build it and see what happens, scale it up, see where it falls over. And so that's what we're doing. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm happy to be part of such a great event here at the MIT Bitcoin Expo. And I think we have a few questions, time for a few questions if you have them.
Awesome. Thank you, Anders. Awesome. We have 3 questions here, and a few more may come in. So number 1, in your models, is the CBDC owned by the people directly, or are you using commercial banks as intermediaries? What role do you envision the banks playing in your new construct?
Yeah, great question. So it treads toward the policy side of things, and what we're trying to do is show what the landscape is. Okay, so we're not saying this must be one thing or another. We're not saying it has to have accounts with KYC or not. We're trying to look at what the entire sort of set of options are. So we're not saying this or that. What we're doing though is taking some deep dives in some areas, making some choices sort of up front, and then rolling with it. I don't know that I feel like you could, if you have one, you can make the other. If you have something that operates as a digital bearer asset, it seems relatively straightforward to be able to put something in the middle, and so you could implement it either way, right? So we're sort of looking at the whole panoply of options.
Great. Okay, so this next one comes from one of your self-proclaimed fans, and I guess he was at your previous company. What is the connection, if any, between communications platform as a service and CBDCs?
Probably no connection other than they both operate on the internet. I'll give you a quick sort of answer of how they connected for me. So I was running R&D at a telecom company, and the CEO comes into my office and says, I want you to stop whatever you're doing, sit back in your chair, throw pencils into the ceiling, and tell me what will disrupt our company. And so I said, okay. And I, looked and eventually saw Bitcoin and realized that, hey, wait a second, here's a decentralized way to come to consensus about what is truth. So what is the phone company? It's basically the master list that a single centralized entity. So that's going to be it. That's going to disrupt you. So, we dove into that. It hasn't yet disrupted telecom, but, maybe it will. And so that's sort of the connection, sort of obscure.
Thank you for bringing us in on it. All right, and then the final question with our time. Has your team had discussions about the necessity to back a CBDC with an existing asset on the grounds that the new currency may not have the public trust and value that the existing currencies possess?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? The question is really, is a CBDC in the case of the Fed, a dollar, right? Would it be a dollar? And if you think about a central bank has two, basically two liabilities. One is cash, which, you pull a bill out of your, not coins, by the way, bill, you pull a bill out and it's a Federal Reserve note. So that's a liability. The other liability is accounts. You don't generally have an account with the Fed. Usually it's financial intermediaries, banks, et cetera. They have a Fed account. And you can swap one to the other. So essentially the one model for rolling this out would be to basically tack on a third one and have the auditing work similarly. So you can take money out of any one of those buckets and put it into any of the others. And they are exact. I think that's, more interesting than kind of saying something is backed, because we have stable coins and we have, stable coins is kind of optimizing for certain use cases, and they are backed by, well, most of them are backed by, in certain ways. And so I feel like that's maybe been done. We're not saying that a token, we're just making, if you think about it, just a swapper from one thing to another, ownership of this to that. That's it. That's kind of what Bitcoin is too, right? So what that thing actually represents, the cash bills used to be backed by silver or gold or something. They're no longer. That the depegging of that was in, I think it was 1971, 72 maybe, and when Nixon closed the gold window. So really, what does it mean to be backed? I mean, if you back them by dollars or it is a dollar, it doesn't seem like a difference to me. But again, this is all policy stuff. I'm really a technical researcher, but those are some of the. One of the interesting things I should say about the Fed is you get to work with 3,000 of the smartest economists in the world, and you can ask them these questions, and they give you really great answers. So it's it's kind of a lot of fun. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Mute again. One last question before you close out. So what problem is the CBDC trying to solve that isn't already solved by peer-to-peer apps such as PayPal, WeChat Pay? Why should I care about CBDC when I already have digital fiat in those apps? Yep.
Right. Yeah. Good point. Right. So we already have digital money, right? We have the ability. Fed accounts are digital money. Well, what's the difference? Well, if the goal of a central bank, and this is general, not the Fed, a goal of the central bank might be for better financial inclusion. It might be to say, look, there's a class of people that are, for whatever reason, not being served by the banks. So maybe there's, something we could do about that. And the internet exists. And so, maybe there's something there. Maybe it suggests that the, like PayPal or whatever the different options might be, maybe there are, areas that they can't serve either. I feel like the internet is here to stay, and having something native on the internet makes a lot of sense. And maybe, having options for being able to support that in some way. I'm not saying like CBDC comes in and completely obliterates the landscape. I really don't see it that way. I think, as central banks decide how to position their CBDCs, they might make different choices. Some might keep a more traditional intermediary. Some might be a direct kind of a thing. Yeah, I mean, I just go back to what is the mandate of the different central banks? Like, do they, financial inclusion is a large one. So that might be something that, would change that.